There's a version of John Lennon that the world knows very well, the one caught in photographs, the sharp wit at press conferences, the fist raised at a demonstration, the face behind round glasses that became one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century. There's the voice on the records, confident, searching, capable of moving between tenderness and fury within the same 4 minutes of music. There is the myth accumulated over decades of retrospective admiration that tends to iron out the contradictions and deliver a figure that is more monument than man. But there is another version, quieter, less documented, existing in the spaces between the performances and the statements and the carefully managed public appearances. The version that appeared when the rooms emptied, when the crowd had filed out and the lights had come down and the music was still present as a vibration in the walls, but the event was over and there was nothing left to perform for. John Lennon sang in empty rooms, not as a romantic gesture and not as a deliberate artistic statement, but because the music did not stop requiring him to make it simply because the audience had gone. And on one particular night, in the full heat of Beatlemania, at the peak of the most extraordinary public career of his generation, he walked into an empty room and sang with more honesty than he had managed in front of 50,000 people earlier that same evening. What happened in that room and what it meant, and why it mattered more than almost anything that happened on a stage, that is the story that no one thought to tell. But to understand that night, you have to understand what performing had become by then. By 1965, the Beatles had been touring for 3 years at a scale and intensity that had no precedent in the history of popular music. The venues had grown from the small clubs of Liverpool and Hamburg, the Cavern, the Star Club, rooms where you could see individual faces in the crowd, to something categorically different, stadiums, arenas. The open-air enormity of Shea Stadium in New York, where 55,000 people gathered in August 1965 and screamed with a volume that the band's amplification could not compete with. The musicians could not hear each other play. John Lennon could not hear his own voice through the monitors. The music was happening in the technical sense, the instruments were being played, the mouths were moving, but the act of musical communication, the exchange between performer and listener that is the essential purpose of a live performance, had become largely theoretical. John understood this before most people around him were willing to acknowledge it. He understood it with the particular clarity of someone who had started playing music not for crowds but for himself, in his bedroom in Woolton, in Julia's sitting room, in the back rooms of Liverpool pubs where the audience was sparse and indifferent, and the only thing that kept you playing was the music itself. He had not forgotten what the music felt like when it was stripped of everything except its essential purpose. He had not forgotten, and in the vastness of the stadiums and the roar of the crowds, he missed it in a way that was difficult to express to people who had never experienced it. The performances themselves had become a kind of endurance. The screaming crowd was real, the emotion in those thousands of faces was genuine. Directed at the stage was not manufactured, but it was love for an idea rather than a sound. The audience was not listening to the music. They were experiencing their own response to the idea of the Beatles, which was something different and something that had, by 1965, become almost entirely disconnected from what was actually being played. Paul McCartney adapted to this with characteristic pragmatism. If the audience couldn't hear the music properly, you put on a show that was worth watching. He understood the theatrical dimension of what they were doing and leaned into it, giving the crowd the visual spectacle that the sonic experience could no longer reliably provide. George Harrison retreated into himself with increasing deliberateness, already moving toward the spiritual searching that would define his later years, already sensing that what he needed from music was not available in a stadium at this scale. Ringo Starr played with the unshakable steadiness that was his great gift, keeping time in the chaos with a precision that looked effortless and cost considerably more than that, the drummer as the band's anchor, holding the rhythm even when no one in the building could hear it clearly. And John Lennon, John performed. He played the character the world expected, worked through the setlist with professional efficiency, delivered the moments that the crowd had come for, and did it all with enough surface conviction that most people watching could not have guessed at the distance between what was happening on stage and what was happening inside him. But the distance was there. It had been there since the venues had grown too large for the music to function as music, and when the show was over and the screaming had moved outside to the streets and the arena was beginning its return to ordinary silence, he looked for a room where he could be alone with an instrument. The night in question came during the North American tour of 1965. The specific city is less important than the specific circumstance. A large venue, a sold-out show, the usual machinery of a Beatles concert, the police cordons and the hysteria and the motorcade and the temporary transformation of an ordinary sports arena into something resembling the physical manifestation of collective ecstasy. The show had gone as shows went in that period, technically present, emotionally distant. 50,000 people believing they had experienced something, and 4 musicians knowing that what they had experienced was something else. After the concert, the band was moved through the usual security protocols, the back exits and the decoy vehicles and the hotel with its blocked-off floor and the minders at every stairwell. The others had gone to their rooms. The hangers-on and the journalists and the local promoters and the handlers had settled into the suite the label had booked for the after-show, where the television was on and no one was watching it, and everyone was performing a slightly different version of being comfortable with being near the Beatles. John did not go to the after-show. He had gone to these things enough times to know what they were, not relaxation, but a continuation of the public performance in a smaller room. He went instead to a room he had noticed earlier in the day, a rehearsal space attached to the venue, 1 floor below the main arena. Small, bare-walled, with an upright piano against one wall and the faint residual smell of cigarette smoke. An old wood that rehearsal rooms accumulate over years of being exactly what they are. He had a guitar with him. He almost always had a guitar with him, not the stage instrument which had gone with the crew, but a smaller acoustic he traveled with, the kind of guitar you play because you need to rather than because someone is watching. He went to the rehearsal room alone. He sat down, and he began to play. What came out in that room was not the setlist he had just performed. It was not the polished material of a working band at the height of its commercial power. It was something earlier and rougher and more direct, fragments of songs that were still becoming themselves, half-formed melodic ideas that had been circling him for weeks without resolving, the kind of musical thinking that happens in the space between one thing and the next. He played version of a song about his mother that was not yet a song, more a series of chords and a melody that kept returning to the same phrase, insistent and unresolved. He played something that would eventually become, years later and through considerable transformation, a part of the music he made after the Beatles ended. He played things that never became anything at all, that existed only in that room on that night, and then dissolved back into the general musical consciousness from which they had briefly emerged. He sang quietly, not the full voice of a performance, the voice projected and placed and controlled for the specific acoustics of a large venue. The voice he used in that rehearsal room was smaller and more unguarded, the voice of someone singing for the music rather than for an audience. It cracked occasionally in places the performance voice never would have permitted. It went into registers that were more honest than comfortable. It did not sound like the John Lennon on the records, and that was precisely the point, though John would not have described it in those terms. He would have said simply that in the rehearsal room he could hear himself. That was what the stadiums had taken away. Not the audiences, and not even the music exactly, but the ability to hear himself while he played. To receive the music back as he was making it, to exist in the exchange between the sound going out and the sound returning, the feedback loop that is the most essential experience of playing music, and that 50,000 screaming people eliminated as completely as if they had simply turned the volume off. In the empty room, with no one listening, he could hear himself, the people who knew John Lennon well in that period, roadie Mal Evans, who traveled with the band throughout the touring years and understood them with the particular intimacy of someone who was present for the private moments between the public ones, have spoken about this quality in John. The tendency to disappear after shows, the guitar that was always nearby, the specific sound, heard occasionally through a closed door in a hotel corridor, of someone playing without the intention of being heard. Mal Evans encountered John in at least one of these sessions. He did not enter the room. He stopped in the corridor, listened for a moment, and moved on. He said later, in interviews given years after everything had changed, that what he heard through those doors was different from anything he heard on stage, that the voice was the same instrument but being used for a completely different purpose. That it sounded, he said, like someone talking to themselves, but talking to themselves in the way that people do when they are trying to work something out, not absent-mindedly, but with focus and seriousness and the specific quality of attention that appears when the stakes are real. What John was working out in those empty rooms across the cities of North America and Europe was nothing less than who he was when the performance requirements were removed. This is a question that fame makes genuinely difficult to answer, because fame creates a continuous performance requirement, not always consciously maintained, but structurally present, built into every interaction with the world. The person who becomes famous young, as John has very few models for how to exist outside the performance. The performance becomes the habitat, and everything else. The private self, the unguarded voice, the music that exists before it becomes music, has to find the cracks and edges to survive in. The rehearsal rooms and the hotel rooms and the dressing rooms after the crowds had gone were those cracks and edges. They were the spaces where John Lennon remained John Lennon when the surrounding world was insisting, with enormous persistence, that he be something larger and less specific. The 1966 touring season would be the last. The final concert of the Beatles as a touring band took place at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966. The venue held approximately 25,000 people. The show lasted 30 minutes. The band played 11 songs. For a period that had defined a decade of popular music, it was a strikingly quiet ending, not celebrated at the time as a final chapter, but understood by those on stage as something that could not continue in its current form. Paul McCartney, anticipating that this might be the last show, had brought a camera and asked Mal Evans to take photographs from the stage, an unusual gesture, sentimental in the way that final things become sentimental even before they are confirmed as final. John did not bring a camera. He did not need a photograph of the stage. He needed something else. After Candlestick Park, the band retired from live performance and turned to the recording studio, to the controlled environment where the music could be heard while it was being made, where the feedback loop was intact, where it was possible to play something and receive it back and adjust and play it again. The records that followed, Revolver Sgt, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the White Album, reflected the liberation of musicians who had been freed from the impossible conditions of stadium performance and returned to a space where the music could actually be heard. John threw himself into the studio work with the relief of someone who had been holding their breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. The intimate, searching quality that had appeared in the empty rehearsal rooms began to appear in the recordings, not as a direct translation, but as the same instinct finding a new and better container. The voice that had cracked in the hotel room, that had gone into honest registers rather than comfortable ones, found its way into songs like Strawberry Fields Forever, where the fragility was part of the point, where the self-examination was structural rather than incidental. He had learned something in those empty rooms that the stadiums could never have taught him. He had learned what his voice actually sounded like when it had no audience to perform for, and he had learned that that sound, unguarded, imperfect, searching, was the most valuable thing he had. Years later, after the Beatles, after the political activism and the experimental records and the Plastic Ono Band and Imagine and the 5 years of domestic retreat in New York, John gave an interview in which he was asked about the touring years. He spoke about them with a candor that surprised the interviewer, not the expected nostalgia for the golden period, but a more complicated account of what those years had actually felt like from the inside. He spoke about the noise, about the inability to hear the music while performing it, about the specific loneliness of being surrounded by 50,000 people who were not, in any meaningful sense, listening to what you were playing, and he mentioned, briefly and without emphasizing it, the rooms, the empty rooms after the shows where he would take a guitar and play until the music came back. The interviewer moved on to another question. The moment passed, but what John had described in those few sentences was the most important practice of his creative life. The insistence on finding, even in the middle of the most overwhelming public career in the history of popular music, a space that was quiet enough to hear himself in. He never stopped needing those rooms. The specific form they took changed. Rehearsal spaces became recording studios, became the kitchen of the Dakota building at 3 a.m, became the office where he kept a piano during the years he spent at home with Sean. But the need was constant. the need to be alone with the music. To sing. Without performing, to hear the voice coming back without the interference of an audience's love, which was real and which was also, in its own way, a kind of noise. He was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, outside his home in New York. He was 40 years old. In the months before his death, he had returned to the studio to record Double Fantasy, music that carried the specific quality of someone who had been alone with themselves long enough to know what they sounded like, and had chosen to bring that sound back into the public world without losing what the solitude had given them. The empty rooms had prepared him for everything, for the records that changed music, for the honesty that outlasted the fame, for the voice that people still return to decades later, not because it was perfect, but because it sounded true, because somewhere in the making of it, in a rehearsal room below a stadium, or a hotel corridor at midnight, or a kitchen at 3 a.m, it had been allowed to be exactly what it was. That is what the empty rooms gave him. That is what they always give.